Chapter 3 of Living Time by Maurice Nicoll. Different levels of reality in man and the universe. There is a great amount of literature dealing with records of new experiences in consciousness that point to the existence of higher forms or levels of consciousness than we ordinarily know. On the psychological side, the idea of levels in man is a very old one. It is found in ancient teachings and appears in most medieval philosophical systems. The idea of scale, which is also an old one, is bound up with the idea of levels. But since the time when the external world became the main object of study, it has been nearly lost sight of. The senses show us apparently everything on the same scale, though of different sizes and at different distances. The eye can pass from a star to a human cell under the microscope without any particular difficulty. Yet we are passing from one order of things to another, and they cannot be taken on the same scale. The quantitative approach to things does not give the sense of scale, which is qualitative. Although the idea of scale exists in the numerical series for the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, are followed by the repetition of the same numbers on another scale, the strange symbol naught or nothing being used to indicate this. Not only was scale in the mind conceived of in older thought, that is, different levels of consciousness, but the universe itself was regarded from the standpoint of scale. Higher and lower are in man and the universe. Sometimes these levels were spoken of as being discontinuous, that is, separated by nothing. Let us study briefly some of the earliest conceptions of the structure of the universe in conjunction with the conceptions about man. At the dawn of our civilization, Pythagoras taught that the universe is a harmony. The word had distinct meanings. The Pythagoreans connected it with the musical scale. Burnet points out that it had the meaning of octave. In the second place, harmony meant the tension of opposites held in balance. And this is from Heraclitus. The harmonious structure of the world depends on opposite tension, like that of the bow or the lyre. End quote. Some thought that the universe could be represented by a scale of numbers. This was a definitely Pythagorean idea. Burnet believed that these numbers signified dimensions, i.e. 1 meant a point, 2 a line, 3 a plane, etc. The harmony of the world was called the soul of the world, just as musical harmony depends on certain numerical proportions in the length of strings. The universe was thought to be constructed so its various parts were in harmonic relationship. From this point of view, the universe is not haphazard, but an established order. For this reason, Pythagoras gave to it the name cosmos, a word which came to mean order. The soul of man was also regarded as a harmony. Plato speaks of the different elements in man as lying in a state of disorder, but being capable of reaching a harmony on the principle of scale, as in a musical chord, where the various notes on different levels are brought into accord. The lowest and most irrational part of man touches the world of the senses. The highest approximates to the world of ideas and is beyond the level of logical reason. Plato describes these degrees in man as being comparable to 4 levels of mental development. In his theory of knowledge, they correspond to 4 forms of knowing. The lowest is little more than a simple consciousness of the images of objects. This lowest state gives the most superficial view of the world and conveys the least knowledge. Ikasia. The mental state is nothing but a series of images and dreams. Shadows, images and dreams are the most obvious types of unreality, and the contrast between them and realities is very striking to early thinkers, as it is to a mind which is just beginning to think, said Nettleship. In the well-known analogy, Plato compares the ordinary mental state of man to that of a prisoner chained in a cave with his face to the wall, on which are thrown the shadows of real things outside the cave, of which latter he can begin to have no true idea. He realises his situation and turns himself around. This is the state of Acacia, and it is characterised by continual uncertainty and vagueness. A living, as it were, in a dream, a world of shadows and fears. In this state of illusion, man is simply a dim reflex of the changing world in time, a procession of images caught by the senses. We are mainly in this internal state of Acacia for the major part of our lives. This is the state in which the soul lives at the bottom of the scale of reality within us. For while the harmony, or scale, is sometimes called the soul itself, at other times the soul is spoken of as an energy that can be related to the higher or lower gradations in this scale. The next stage defined by Plato is that of pistis. In this state we get to know by experience some of the tangible facts of life. We feel certain about some things and form definite opinions, or opinions are formed in us by imitation. These opinions may be quite contradictory if we come to examine them. But because each of them gives us a feeling of certainty, we do not investigate them deeply and do not wish to do so. It is sufficient that we have something to hold on to. This is the stage of pistis, or belief in opinions, and however naive it may be, it gives some feeling of certainty. So we find people in different countries with certain similar beliefs in the tangible things of existence, and quite different beliefs about the nature of things in general, but having some feeling of certainty in common. While there may be truth in some of these beliefs, as mere belief, the inner perception of their truth is hindered. Both the above states of mind were classed by Plato as opinion, doxa. Belief and the perception of shadows are not the waking reality. They are not understanding. One may hold a correct opinion, but as long as it is an opinion, it is not the perception of truth, but only a kind of dream about it, i.e., the mind is not awakened. When people begin to examine their opinions and find contradictions in their various beliefs, they begin to search for principles or some unity underlying variety. Plato calls this stage of mental development dianoia. When we reason from hypotheses, as in geometry, we use this dianoetic thinking, or when we try to find a law connecting together various perceived phenomena. These two examples are, of course, not similar. Scientific thought is dianoetic in that it endeavours to abstract from the mass of sensible things in order to establish simple laws that explain phenomena descriptively. Above this he puts the highest level in man, nous, mind. We may perhaps be able to see dimly something of what was meant by this term. If we could see all the relations and affinities that an object has simultaneously, instead of as a confused collection of separately noticed properties, which often seem to be contradictory, we would be on the noetic level of conscious experience. And now we have another quote from Nettleship. Suppose that different men of science had set themselves to work to exhaust all the properties of an object, and that all these properties came to be understood, we should regard the object as the centre in which a number of laws of nature, or what Plato would call forms, ideas, converged. End quote. The separate sensible properties of the object would be merged into its total significance. It would be seen as an expression of the universe, so that while nothing that our senses told us of it would be lost sight of or wrong, it would be invested with a meaning that transcended all sensible perception and would become a manifestation of intelligible form or idea. At this noetic level, the world would be experienced in a new way, i.e., as regards the interconnection, relation, meaning, and significance of everything that we perceive. Noetic experience can only be individually known. The sharing of knowledge by a number of people who know different sides of the same question could not possibly give noesis, as Nettleship seems to imply. Since the noetic level of conscious experience and Plato's world of forms or ideas are closely related, we must look for a moment at the cosmological theory in which the latter appears. All visible creation is regarded as an imperfect copy of invisible ideas or forms which can only be apprehended by mind, nous, at its highest level. Our senses reveal to us only copies. These copies exist in passing time, for everything visible, every sensible object, exists in passing time. The ideas are apart from time, but they are reflected into objects in time. Man thus stands between a sensible world of copies and an intelligible, mentally perceptible world of true forms, of which these copies are representations. This cosmological theory contains three terms. 1. That which becomes, which is the copy in time. 2. That wherein it becomes. 3. The model on which that which becomes, the copy, is based. We now have a quote from Timaeus, from 50. We may compare the recipient with the mother, the model with the father, and that which arises between them with their child. End quote. Visible creation in time, or nature, therefore, does not exist of itself. It is not the cause of itself, but is an ever-changing copy of something which lies behind appearances. The recipient, or mother, is three-dimensional space, which must be empty of all properties in order to receive the impress of the model. The copy is in time. The model, idea, is outside our space and time. Since the copy is in time, it is always changing, always manifesting itself only partially. The full expression of itself lies in this first pattern or original model beyond our time. If, then, we ever reach the noetic level of experience, our inward perception of the model would invest the outward copy with intense significance. Our intuition of the model, as direct cognition, would be free from all properties of sense. It would be knowledge apart from sense, but inasmuch as it met the sensible copy in outer space, it would exalt it into its total significance, because its whole form would be internally perceived. Plato observes this at this level of conscious experience. The world presents itself as a scale or series of orders of existence, each connected with the one above it and the one below it. One form of preparation for the reaching of this state is indicated, the exercising of the power of seeing together the relationships that exist between the various branches of available knowledge, i.e., progress in knowledge is progress in the perception of the unity of knowledge. If we imagine that a branch of knowledge can exist separately by itself, we are in error, for everything is connected in order of scale or harmony. Let us pass from Plato to one psychological aspect of the Christian doctrine. It is a necessary idea of religion that there is a higher state of man. In Christian terminology, man is hylic, psychic, and finally pneumatic. This is surely not so much a question of types of men, but of levels of man. At the hylic level, we have a purely sensual conception of nature as cause of itself. Hyl equals matter. At the psychic level, which I am unable to define, we can have apparently all sorts of opinions and beliefs about life, right or wrong, that are imagination. It was the awakening of the pneumatic or spiritual nature that was the object of the Christian teaching, just as the aim of the Platonic discipline was to awaken the level of nous. The natural or sensual ideas that we derive from our ordinary experiences of life are not sufficient to awaken this third nature. We find the attribute of unchangingness always associated with the highest level of conscious experience. The experiences of truth are always similar. There is the changing mind, following time and change, and the unchanging mind behind it. There is the order of natural reasoning that goes with changing phenomena, and another above it. And we have a quote now For examining what caused me to admire the beauties of bodies, celestial or terrestrial, and what I used in judging things changeable and in pronouncing this ought to be thus and this not, examining, I say, what was the cause of my so judging, seeing I did so judge, I found the unchangeable and true eternity of truth above my changeable mind. And thus by degrees I passed from body to the soul, which perceives through the senses of the body, and thence to its inward faculty, to which the bodily senses communicate external things. And so far even beasts possess this." End quote. This is the imagination in the original sense of the word. The senses lead into a receptive image-forming organ which we possess in common with the beasts. Beyond this is the reasoning faculty, to which is referred for judgment whatsoever is received from the senses. And when this found itself in me also to be a changeable thing, it raised itself up in its own understanding and drew away my thoughts from the power of habit, withdrawing itself from those contradictory phantasms, that so it might discover what that light was, whereby it was bedewed, when without any doubtfulness it cried out that the unchangeable is to be referred to the changeable, whence also it knew the unchangeable itself, which, unless it had in some way known, it had had no sure ground to prefer it to the changeable. And thus with the flash of one trembling glance it arrived at that which is." End quote. In these words Augustine describes the ladder of levels in man as known by him through his own experience, and the similarity between his description and that given by Plato is evident. In his philosophical system, Augustine took the spirit of man as a substance, different from body and yet everywhere present in the body, manifesting itself through the organs of the body as different functions, e.g. through the cerebellum, according to him, as the power of voluntary movement. In himself he regarded it as divided into 7 degrees, i.e. as a harmony or scale. The highest degrees transcended the natural reason. Regarded spiritually, man is nothing but will, but the quality of his will is different in these different degrees. As a creature of self-will, self-love, he has no being, no real existence. He is only the lowest level of himself. He has no centre of gravity in himself, an idea which seems at first sight paradoxical. His truest being lies in the topmost degrees in the scale of spirit, and unless these degrees begin to open in him, we are told he is incapable even of doing good. The source of all truth lies in unchangeable truth, which is above the level of reason, and it is the internal perception of this unchangeable truth that endows man with the highest grade of being. This unchangeable truth is the divine logos, or ordered plan, and in identifying knowledge with the logos, or word, Augustine is in agreement with the Platonists. We must understand that the perception of this truth is an internal experience. It is not of the same nature as external truth, which comes from the direction of the senses, or when we reason about the outer nature of things. Some writers have said that all true knowledge must be born in man, and that he cannot have any real knowledge, even of nature, apart from this, because the natural reason can only trade in the outside surface of things, take measurements, weigh, etc., but cannot in this way reach the understanding of any person or thing. In other words, the point of view is that there is an order of truth in us, and once born into the light of consciousness, it is its own proof. But when it is lost sight of, and we begin to reason and dispute about it, we enter a circle of irreconcilable contradictions, for the logical reason does not belong to that level which we are to connect with the internal perception of this unchanging truth. For this reason, the real truths behind religion and philosophy inevitably become matters of dispute, which led to wars and persecutions. For the natural logical reason, in mystical terminology, has no higher birth than the spirit of this world. It can only view things in a certain light derived from sensible experience, and is turned outwards towards the phenomena of space and time. And psychologically, it is bound up with self-love, that is, with the feelings of I, from which we derive the ordinary sense of our value. Now, the Platonists regarded thought in its purest form as actual vision, the object of the vision being unchanging truth or the intelligible world, the realm of meaning itself. This pure thought, which is not really thought as we understand it, lies above all the processes of reasoning and argument. Flashes of it are said to transform momentarily the entire understanding. This is the transforming power latent in man, i.e., a higher level of conscious experience. The later Platonists took the view that every contact with the intelligible world, or world of ideas, transformed the soul, which ultimately could reach the degree of comprehending the whole perfection of the intelligible universe. In this breadth of insight, we are told, evil disappears, merely because the true and necessary relation of everything is seen aright. I would call the reader's attention to the point that if we believe a higher level of consciousness is latent in man, any experience of its activity must act in a direction entirely different from what is usual. In following the evidence of the senses, we accept the sum of reality more or less as lying on the side of the senses. That there is anything else more real in its effect is not something that we can easily be convinced about. But if noetic experience is possible, it must come from another side, and so must involve a reversal in ordinary process. Here we are dealing with a question which does not belong to the order of time. If we believe in the temporal progress of man, then we also believe that he will eventually discover all possible truth. From this point of view, one sees truth as something lying far ahead in time, towards which mankind is pressing. Someday, we think, people will find out everything. But if we put a higher level above all the changeable processes in man, and connect with it a form of consciousness that gives us insight into truth beyond any given by the form of consciousness we ordinarily know, then truth is not something lying in time, in the future, but something here, now, only above us, above our present consciousness. For some people it is difficult to think except in terms of time. They cannot conceive orders of existence, or degrees of understanding, or levels of consciousness, as forming part of some inherent structure of things, always present. To think from this latter standpoint requires, I repeat, something of a reversal in our customary way of thinking. To this I will return in a later chapter. I must ask the reader to consider some of the other older cosmological theories, particularly because they do not regard the visible world in time as the sum total of reality. Let us take the system of Eriugena and examine it briefly. This system belongs to the 10th century AD, and its general standpoint, like that of the Pythagorean Platonic one that we have glanced at, can be expressed by the phrase visibilia ex invisibilibus. The visible is derived from the invisible. It is a system based on scale. According to all systems of this kind, we live in a created universe in which nothing lives of itself, for the entire universe, including that part of it on which our senses open, is connected together. At the top of the scale of reality, Eriugena puts mind itself, or deity, defining it as that which creates but is not created. Where then is this mind from which the order of the whole universe is derived? We are told that God is neither in space nor time, that mind, in the supreme sense, the power that gives order to all, cannot be understood by our passive reason, upon which are impressed natural ideas derived from our sensible experience, and that no natural thought can compass its measure. For it is outside the visible world set in space and running in time. We next learn that from this mind is first derived the order of ideas, of which we have already spoken, of which all created things are copies. This order cannot, of course, be apprehended through natural sense. Thus the ideas, the second order, are created, and in their turn they create. They create, ultimately, the order of life with which we are familiar, the visible world of people, animals and plants. We can imagine an architect informing some pupils of his plans and leaving them to carry out his instructions. But we must also imagine that the conditions under which these instructions are to be carried out are definitely limited. As working examples or experiments of the ideas, we are subject to pass in time, in which nothing can be instantaneously realized. Everything must conform to a process of transition from moment to moment. The third order is, therefore, the order of created things, including ourselves, that we perceive in time, which are necessarily imperfect copies of the idea that proceed from mind. We understand, therefore, that the phenomenal world is actually a world of effects whose causes lie at a higher level in the scale of reality. While these effects are themselves related to one another in a certain sequence in time order, which we can study scientifically, we cannot reach causes in a proper sense. We learn further that what is outside time is free from opposites and inner contradictions. In time, we experience everything in the form of opposites, and our thinking is based to a large extent, if not entirely, upon opposites. It follows that mind itself is beyond our natural level of thought. For this reason, Eriugena says that we cannot apply any name or known quality to God. He can be called truth, good, justice, or any name we like, but all such predicates imply an opposite. Since we think by means of words to which we can find an opposite, it is impossible for us to conceive the nature of God. The world scale of Eriugena then appears as a scale of descent, from the whole and perfect into the divided and less perfect, from pattern to copy. I have given the scale as briefly as possible. In one sense, it is easy for us to admit that the visible is derived from the invisible, because all visible matter is built out of smaller and still smaller parts, and finally out of atoms and electrons, which in themselves are quite invisible. These older systems, however, regarded the universe from the standpoint of man's position in it, his significance with regard to it, his possibilities, etc. If we think of the world as merely composed of electrons and say that only they constitute the invisible world, we cannot really connect this view with ourselves. It does not increase our understanding or show us any possibilities. We may establish the view that the atom is like a small solar system in which the electrons revolve in orbits. Further, the view may be established that these orbits represent discontinuous levels of energy, and that the electrons jump into greater orbits by the absorption of definite quantities of radiant energy, and into smaller orbits with the emission of definite quantities of radiant energy. In such theories, however, since the element of mental construction enters largely, we may wonder whether man is not studying his own mind. What we find in the atom may be some reflection of ourselves. If we find levels, and if we find that nothing can ever be predicted accurately in atomic phenomena, it may be that these facts are related to the mind itself. Now, the older views, like those of Eriugena, regarded man and the universe as quite inseparable. Man was held to be a little world, an image of the greater world. Nothing that he discovered about himself did not apply to the world, and nothing that he discovered about the world did not apply to himself. He is microcosmos in macrocosmos. Such a view entitles us to say that from one angle every man is the centre of the universe. Let us look for a moment at this idea, which we will study later. Sometimes the world produces an overwhelming impression, perhaps particularly today, when everything is so abnormally linked up owing to the discoveries in electrodynamics. We hear one another speaking at immense distances. This velocity of radiant energies through which we are put into instantaneous communication with every part of the earth is obviously incommensurable with man, i.e., it is out of all proportion to man's proportions. He is living, as it were, in a world that does not belong to him, and must necessarily feel loss of individuality and locality. He becomes overwhelmed and emotionally dulled, lost in a clamber of outer things. Yet each one of us is at the centre of the world, because he himself sees the world and all that is in it. At the top of the scale of reality, Eriugena puts mind outside space and time. Scientifically, we put all original causes far back in time. From our natural thought, we cannot understand how cause can be regarded otherwise, for our natural ideas arise out of our experience of space and time. We find ourselves in the world passing in time from moment to moment, a world of opposites, of contradictions, and, as it were, of half-truths. Summer is followed by winter, war by peace, and so on, and these opposites are separated by time. What was called our passive reason argues from time and space as we know them. It tries to explain everything on this basis. But when we come to study systems like that of Eriugena, we learn that our space and time are only particular conditions to which mortals are subject. We know, in short, only a limited reality, which is characterized by passage in time. So we are told that the ultimate cause and origin of all things is not a million years ago. It is outside time, now. Eriugena draws certain conclusions from the world scale on which his system is based. Whatever is on the lower level cannot understand a higher level, but can be fully comprehended and understood by what is above, and only finds its full meaning through seeking to enter the reality above it. Man's consciousness is capable of ascending this scale. Since this scale is given as a representation of the true structure of the universe, we are told that everything is in a certain relationship to everything else. We found the same idea in the Pythagorean scale of harmonic proportions. To a certain extent, we know from experience that nothing lives of itself. We perceive that our vital life is drawn from the energy of the sun, which acts on the minute sonar machines and the leaves of plants and in the organisms floating on the surface of the sea. These build up, out of light, air, water and minerals, the food that sustains organic life in general. In this sense, we depend upon what is perceptibly greater and perceptibly lesser for our physical existence. Sun, man, cell are connected. But these are of different orders. The sun is a body of vast energy with an interior temperature of 40 million degrees. The cell is the microscopic watery element of life out of which all living tissue is built. We exist in a universe of relationships in which everything is bound together in an order, so that the whole constitutes a unity. This order is in itself something actual. We find order in the atom, in the limited number of possible orbits surrounding the central proton. We find order in the constitution of man's body, in the interrelationship of its organs and integrations of the nervous system. We find order in the world of stars and planets. We do not find only positive and negative electrical charges or action and reaction, but a third principle, order. Since all is related proportionally and bound together in a common unity of order, the universe for Eriugena is throughout united. The lower is comprehended in the higher, and relative to it is less real. Everything is real, but relatively less real than what is above it. Insofar as man is a little universe in himself, this scale of relative reality exists in him up to a point, so that he is capable of becoming more real, of reaching fuller existence by ascending this scale in himself. The effect of this scheme is to make the world a complex system of degrees of reality, within which every single thing is from one point of view real and existent, and from another unreal and non-existence. The lower existence is unreal in comparison with the higher right through the universe. Unless the whole of things is a disconnected mass of particulars, and therefore not a universe at all, it is impossible to think of every single thing as on the same plane of reality. We secure the relative reality of every single fact, and at the same time the absolute reality of the universe as a rational system, when we hold the manifold appearances of the world to belong to successive orders of reality. Because mind is the ultimate reality and is greater than any perceptible thing, so every perceptible thing exists more in the mind of man than it does in himself, i.e., we can give one another more existence in our mental apprehension of one another. It is not surprising to find, in view of the enormous value that Eriugena places upon man, that he goes so far as to say that everything perceptible to the senses is made for the sake of man's senses. The emphasis is upon man, not upon the outer world, but as a mere creature of sense man has no proper existence. He then suffers evil because of his own relative unreality, because he does not correspond to the reality possible to him. Hell is a state of being, a state not corresponding to anything real, a state of falsity. We have spoken of a higher level of consciousness being characterized by a larger synthesis. If many sides of a question are drawn together suddenly into unitary meaning, then the many are combined into one and a new synthesis results. What then would a new experience of oneself mean in this connection? For we do not only have experiences of the outer world or of relationships to one another, but also inner experiences that have to do with the feeling of I. We can feel ourselves differently. In all those disciplines whose object was to raise people to a higher level of reality, an overcoming of oneself was demanded. For example, a purification of the emotions was held to be necessary, as well as a different way of thinking, a different relationship to people, etc. A change in oneself was held to be necessary because as long as one remained just as one was, one could not have different experiences. Only through new ideas and new efforts could any permanent change be produced. But momentary changes sometimes occur. They indicate to us that there are other states of oneself, and while they last, one is changed for a new feeling of oneself. All change in oneself comes through a changed feeling of oneself. We have what can be called a natural reality in which we dwell. We move in a small orbit of meanings, of notions about ourselves, others, and the world. If this orbit is broken, we are usually in a peculiarly helpless condition, having no idea of anything else. There seems to be nothing to fall back upon. What we actually lose is the ordinary feeling of ourselves. So we become frightened and lost, not so much because of what has happened, but because we cannot recognize ourselves. To become different means another recognition of oneself. We are told that this oneself is capable of changing. But if it changes, there will be another sense of oneself. There are completely new feelings of oneself to which, I believe, people sometimes come very close, without understanding what they are. A person may touch a much better feeling of himself momentarily, without knowing what it is, and perhaps only be frightened of it. He may experience truth in some form which makes everything that usually occupies his attention seem unreal, and merely think that something is seriously wrong with him. We know that there can enter into all that we see, do, think and feel a sense of unrealness. Sometimes it takes the form of seeing the unreality of other people. We observe that some force seems to be hurrying everyone to and fro. We see transiently a puppet world in which people are moved as by strings. Sometimes, however, in place of unreality, an extraordinary intensity of reality is felt. We suddenly see someone for the first time who we have known for years in a kind of stillness. we perceive the reality of another existence, or we perceive the existence of nature suddenly as a marvel for the first time. The same experience, felt in relation to oneself, is the sense of one's own existence, independent of everything else, the realization of one's invisibility, the perception of I, of duration without time. These feelings surround our natural reality. I think that they show us clearly enough that there are other meanings of oneself, or forms of conscious experience. Let us consider an example of a changed state of consciousness and see whether we can regard it in some degree as an example of the reaching of a higher level. It is the familiar one that Tennyson recorded of himself, quote, "A kind of waking trance I have frequently had, quite up from boyhood, when I have been all alone. This has generally come upon me through repeating my own name 2 or 3 times to myself, silently, till all at once, as it were, out of the intensity of the consciousness of individuality, the individuality itself seemed to fade away into boundless being, and this not a confused state, but the clearest of the clearest, the surest of the surest, utterly beyond words, where death was almost a laughable impossibility. The loss of personality, if so it were, seeming no extinction but the only true life. I am ashamed of my feeble description. Have I not said that the state is beyond words?" End quote. We can understand that a higher level will make the lower seem unreal. Tennyson felt the unrealness of his usual state because he felt another kind of realness, which freed him from all that sense of himself that goes with the name. Also, he passed out of the usual sense of time. In the reality that we derive from our experience of passing time, death confronts us. We are incapable of thinking of death, incapable of realizing it as the inner perception of an idea. In the true idea of himself that he touched, death was an impossibility. But death as a visible fact that we try to grasp with the outer mind continually feeds the uneasiness on which most of our life rests, or if it has left a blank in our lives, keeps on dragging us backwards in a useless way. With the sensual concept of life, we cannot meet these difficulties. Passing time makes death an insoluble, incontrovertible problem, blinding our understanding, and from the natural sense we cannot comprehend time save as we experience it. Death is a fact in our natural reality, that is, in our sense-given experience of life, and as long as we cannot understand that we apprehend through the senses only a minute part of total existence and reality, we cannot escape from the violent effect of its suggestion. The experience recorded by Tennyson shows that he touched an entirely new feeling of I. He says that he lost his ordinary sense of personality. This by itself would be a terrible experience. To feel one's ordinary sense of I disappearing would be like death. But in his case, his whole life seems to have been gathered up into a large synthesis, in which his existence became something quite new, above the level of ordinary consciousness and the familiar feelings of I that belong to it, the I conceit of Buddhist teaching. He knew himself, behind the sense of personality by direct cognition, and descending once more to the ordinary level of consciousness, which does not know the higher level, he is unable to find words to describe his experience. He can feel only that his description is entirely inadequate. If we say, then, that this experience belongs to the noetic level, we probably have some right to do so. Only the experience refers to a higher form of knowledge of oneself. It is confined to this, and perhaps we could say to the true idea of form behind the ordinary oneself. The main difference between a standpoint, such as that expressed by Eriugena or Plato, and the naturalistic or materialistic standpoint is that greater reality is posited, lying not ahead of us in future time, but in some other direction independent of time. The reader will understand that all that has been said so far in this chapter relates to the existence of an above and a below, i.e. to scale. In man, as in the universe, there is an above and a below. From the standpoint of consciousness, a higher level of consciousness exists in man, whose quality is not comparable with that of ordinary consciousness. The realities belonging to ordinary consciousness are only relative realities, just as that aspect of the world manifest to the physicist is only relative reality. Just as we know one aspect of the world through the senses, so do we know only one aspect of consciousness. To refer to the analogy of the schoolmaster and class mentioned in the previous chapter, we know only a form of consciousness comparable to a disordered class from which the schoolmaster is absent or in which he is asleep. His awakening is not a matter of future time. We imagine that what we lack must lie in future time, but we have already seen that according to Eriugena's system, greater reality lies above us, not, so to speak, horizontally in the line of past in time, the line of past, present and future, but vertically on another level. This vertical direction does not belong to time. Our strivings have their full fruition not in the horizontal direction, but in the vertical one. We must imagine this direction in reflecting upon Tennyson's experience. Apparently he awoke to another and fuller order of conscious experience. In the philosophical system of Averroes, 12th century, it is said that the fruition of all man's striving is, already and always, attained. This actualization, which is, of course, incomprehensible to our reason, is achieved now and ever, beyond the limiting conditions of time to which we are subjected, and from which our customary mode of thinking is derived. The full fruition of the universe and all that it contains, being already and always actualized, according to this and other thinkers, certainly cannot belong to the time order as we know it. But since the direction of our thinking follows the time order, we have great difficulty in understanding this quite different and singular point of view. According to Averroes, man is constructed in such a way that he can understand this other direction and can indeed only attain happiness when he begins to discover it. Above the passive understanding, it is said, lies an active understanding, which can grasp the nature of this direction. Yet, while all this remains incomprehensible, we can to a certain extent understand what it must mean. It must mean that we are asked to think differently about time. As we shall see later on, it has been said repeatedly that we cannot understand anything rightly unless we overcome the illusion of time. Some transformation of our natural understanding is requisite in order that another level of understanding can be born in us. So much importance was attached by the older thinkers to this higher level of understanding that, as I've already mentioned, we often find it said that no one can say he has real knowledge unless he has felt the influence of this higher degree, i.e., something very definite must happen to a man before he can begin to understand in any real sense. Speaking cosmologically, Averroes says of our ordinary understanding that it belongs to the sublunary world and is incapable of solving the problems that confront us, because it understands nothing. Just as waking makes dreams unreal, so, we are told, does waking to another level of consciousness make all our ordinary problems, preoccupations and perplexities seem unreal. One of the best interpreters of the psychological ideas of Bohm has expressed this standpoint very plainly in the following terms. So this is from William Law. The greatest part of mankind, nay of all Christians, may be said to be asleep, that particular way of life which takes up each man's mind, thought and actions, may be very well called his particular dream. The learned and the ignorant, the rich and the poor, are all in the same state of slumber, passing away a short life in a different kind of dream." End quote. This 18th century writer, William Law, goes on to say in theological language that man has the possibility of some other state above the state of slumber, which is the chief psychological idea found in religion. We must notice the connection that he makes. As we might expect, he connects this state of slumber with time. In this he follows his teacher closely, for Bohm has said that man fell asleep in time. We cannot, of course, understand what this means. In order to begin to understand what this may mean, we require a great many new ideas and conceptions. Law remarks that man can never understand what his life means unless he grasps that his constitution contains a higher possibility within it, which stands above the state of slumber and time. Once a man realizes this possibility, whatever it is, he comes to a new view of himself and of the significance of his life, and this realization, we are told, is to know oneself, to know potentially. So we now have a quote from the works of William Law. "Do but a man to know himself that he comes into this world on no other errand but to arise out of the vanity of time. Do but suppose him to govern his inward thought and outward action by this view of himself, and then to him every day has lost all its evil. Prosperity and adversity have no difference, because he receives them and uses them in the same spirit," etc. This is from volume 7 of the works of William Law. And the same notion, the notion that we are not awake, that we are not at a level of consciousness where we can understand anything rightly, and where it is impossible to know or have anything real, and where we cannot be in control of ourselves because we are not conscious at the point where control would be possible, is found throughout Platonic, Christian, and many other teachings. But consider how difficult, how impossible it is for us to admit that we are asleep in life. It cannot be an admission, it can only be a gradual realization. And such an experience can only be brought about by the influences of efforts and ideas belonging to nearly lost science of awakening. The translators of the Gospels could not have properly understood this idea, for they translated the Greek, I do not read Greek, as watch. Watch therefore and pray, etc. And this word watch is found in many places in the New Testament, but its real meaning is to be awake, and the force of this meaning is incalculably greater than that expressed by the term watch. Because we are told everywhere in the Gospels to be awake, is it not clear that we are at the same time being told that we are asleep, and that self-knowledge is to realize that one is asleep? Heraclitus said, "I sought myself." The doctrine of self-knowledge written over the porch at Delphi is not what we imagine. Only when we realize that we have no self can we seek ourselves. Only through a flash of truth can one understand ignorance and falsity. But this kind of self-knowledge escapes us. Socrates found the first step in self-knowledge to consist in becoming aware that we do not know ourselves, and indeed do not know anything. We pretend to know everything. In realizing our ignorance, in catching a glimpse of pretense, in ceasing blindly to believe in opinions, slogans, words, we begin to know ourselves. We begin to awaken out of a dream. Our consciousness begins to be increased just in what we perhaps might suppose to be a direction leading to an opposite result. But if you know you do not know, you are more conscious. Oneself becomes thus the instrument for awakening. The more we lie to ourselves, the more we are asleep. Consider today the power of lies and the increasing lack of resistance to them, and so the increasing sleep of the world. Man has fallen asleep in matter and in time and in himself, but let us note how he is put in the great allegory of creation. Man is tempted by the serpent which crawls on its belly in the dust. Where our feet touch the earth is where the domain of the senses begins. Here man is a creature of sense, sense-minded, sensual. Here his wisdom is of the senses. To kill your enemy is wisdom of the senses, for your enemy disappears. Your senses no longer register his existence. All the cleverness of materialism enters here to make man think he knows. And though every sensible object is a mystery, and the senses themselves are a mystery, he feels he can take hold of the sensible world not only to enjoy it as he pleases, but to mould it to his commands. In this sense he eats the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He takes good and evil into himself and decides himself what should be done. And this necessary step leads on not to recovery, but to the idea that he can rule. He becomes much wiser than the universe in his own estimation. It seems to him he can conquer all things, although his inner weakness, ignorance, and lack of control remain unchanged. The whole problem of mankind remains as before, but it is hidden under an embroidery of words, a new state, a new humanity, a paradise of material discoveries. But who is going to start from himself to render himself fit for any possible paradise, and how to do it? What is going to raise the sensual up? Who shall either interpret science or place it in its place? Nothing that is in its right place can be wrong if it keeps its place. Mankind can be dragged down by a surfeit of increasingly sensual interpretation, which does not either cover the facts or afford the right medium of presentation. Everyone has in him more functions, more capacities, more sides to himself than could possibly be satisfied by sheer materialism. The serpent must be lifted up in the wilderness. Who shall raise it? What spark shall kindle the marbles of science and transform them into the marbles of the universe? Can science cease to be animated by the latent spirit of hostility, and can it create in man the free sense of wonder and awe in place of the spirit of denial? We are told that we are asleep and can awaken, and when, as Law puts it, we begin to grasp this, we see that we are all living in a kind of dream, a fact we sometimes become aware of in moments of great danger or emotion. You must notice that this is not a pessimistic doctrine. If you tell a man who is lying in the mud that all is mud, the teaching will be negative. When the writer to the Ephesians says, "Awake, thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead," he means by the quotation that we are like dead people and live the life of dead people, and that our state of sleep is really death. Not beginning with ourselves, we do not see ourselves. To awaken is to see more clearly. At such a moment one may see how people are dead. One can see the terrible emotions that govern humanity, written on their faces, which they nourish without clearly seeing what they are doing. The idea of the Christian teaching at its source, before it becomes externalized and organized into machinery, was about awakening from sleep through the light shed by the inner meaning of the teaching. Christ was one who had awakened and taught others one way of awakening. The whole idea of following certain rules, precepts and ideas was not for any moral end, but in order to arise from the dead, to reach a possible inner evolution. And so that writer to the Ephesians says, "Awake thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light. See that ye walk circumspectly." So notice where one is going internally is to be more conscious to oneself. In this way, the writer adds, you will redeem the time. To return to Law, whatever we understand in particular of what he says, it is obvious that he regards our ordinary degree of consciousness as being comparable to a dream state, and that our entire life, career, profession, our actions, thoughts, and so on are dreamlike. We live in a kind of dream from which it is possible for us to awaken, and, again, we must note the point, this arousal from slumber is connected with another sense of time. If, then, we are willing to admit the possibility that there is a higher level of consciousness, or a further degree of experience inherent in our nature, we have to suppose that another understanding of time is connected with it. It is extremely difficult to see what is meant here. Let us say at present that our ordinary level of consciousness, which Law emphatically says is a condition of sleep, and therefore unreal relatively to a higher order, is bound up with our ordinary experience of time. Or rather, it is bound up with our notion of time and with all the deductions and conclusions that we make by taking time to be what it seems. Let us suppose that at the level of our ordinary conscious state, all our thoughts and feelings and our understanding in general have a certain arrangement common to us all, and let us suppose that this arrangement is to a great extent due to the appearance of things as conditioned by time. As long as we passively regard time as what it seems sensually to be, as a moment passing into nothingness, we necessarily inhabit this level, i.e., our ordinary level of consciousness is closely bound up with our ordinary view of time. Let us go no further at present save to say that noetic experience, that is, conscious experience on a higher level beyond our state of slumber, is beyond time sequence, so that we can understand a little how a different view of time may open the way to the possibilities of new experiences. Actually, we should say rather that an internal perception of the meaning of another view of time might bring about this result. We would not suppose it comes merely from theoretical thinking. To be told that time is an illusion does not help anybody unless they have already caught a glimpse of another idea of time, but one can readily see that one's ordinary consciousness is very much dominated by time, and that a great deal of our fear and anxiety is a matter of time. What do we think about time? We exist in a world that we do not understand in the least. What is nature? What is time? What is space? What are we? We take all for granted. We do not face any real issues in our thinking, but catch hold of some ready-made opinion. Do we ever get used to the mystery of time, for instance? Is not the problem of time always in the background of our minds, although we can never really think about it? Consider the strange experience that a person was, but is no more. Consider our childhood and death. Where is all that which has become, was, and all that will be? What is this strange now and then, which when perceived together cause the mind to tremble on the verge of new meaning? We stand before ruins and wonder at the mystery of once upon a time. We cannot grasp what it means. We feel close to meaning that is potential, but which we cannot reach. Again, we may feel how strange it is that we live among people of every age, people whose time lies in front of them and people whose time lies behind them, all inserted into a common point of another time, crowded into what is called the present moment of the world, different times meeting in the same time. Now, for our ordinary understanding, time is a sort of nothingness. All that we know by direct experience is a hypothetical point of time which we call the present moment. In this present moment we see things ending and beginning, old and new, things passing out of existence and things coming into existence. And we know that this present moment is somehow moving and always turning into another present moment. No matter whether we are sitting still or walking about, this movement of time is always going on. But we cannot think about it. We cannot think about it in the same way as we can think about something we can see or touch. We do not think about time because we cannot grasp it with sense as we can a solid object lying in the 3 dimensions of space. We grasp the 3 dimensions of space through the visible objects that exist in it. They have length, breadth and height. Each of these directions is at right angles to the other. We say that a box is a 3-dimensional object. A shadow on the wall is 2-dimensional. It has length and breadth but no thickness insofar as it lies on the wall. It is merely a surface and so 2-dimensional. A line in the geometrical sense is 1-dimensional. It only has one length. But turning from space, what can we say of time save that it is a moment that somehow or other moves into the next, then into the next, in a manner which we cannot think about because we cannot see this movement and can only mark it artificially by the hands of the clock, which we regulate according to the movements of the earth. We think of time as minutes, hours, days, years, but our thought does not get much beyond this, for how can we think save from natural ideas derived from what we see? We cannot see time. Time is invisible, and naturally we do not think of time as a dimension to be added to the 3 dimensions of space. Yet any object has not only length, breadth and height, it has time also, or it would vanish. It is extended in time as well in space. Until the beginning of this century, the science of physics, which treats of the motions of bodies, the measurements of quantities, and the nature of the external world, took space and time separately. The world for it was 3-dimensional, and time was something apart, i.e. space and time were treated as if they were independent of one another. The free coordinates of space, which correspond to rectangular lines drawn in the dimensions of length and of breadth and of height, let them be called x, y, z, were taken independently of time, t. But the objects of our perception invariably include places and times in combination. Nobody has ever noticed a place except at a time, or a time except at a place. A point of space at a point of time, that is a system of values, x, y, z, t, I will call a world point. The multiplicity of all thinkable x, y, z, t values we will christen the world. And that's from Minkowski, The Principle of Relativity. An object must always be in a certain place at a certain time, and to define its position in the universe in spatial terms only is not sufficient. A motor car passes a particular spot in the road which we can define spatially by taking coordinates and measurements. A man passes over the same spot, and relative to our coordinates he will be in exactly the same place as the car. But if we leave out time in that case, the car and the man must collide. A further coordinate or value must be added, for although both the car and the man pass the same spot, an interval of time separates them. Observe the result of adding this fourth coordinate of time. We enter at once the invisible world, for to our visible world, perception, the world is three-dimensional, and the spot on the road that both the car and the man pass is the same visible spot in the three-dimensional world. It is the same place in the three-dimensional world, but it is not the same place in the four-dimensional world. In Minkowski's language, the spot on the road with the car passing it and the same spot on the road with the man passing it later are two quite separate world points. Time is thus taken as an element of the four-dimensional world, that is, of a world quite different from that perceptible to our senses. Our senses do not inform us of the four-dimensional world, but only of a world point, which appears as a three-dimensional world moving in time. Now every object, insofar as it persists in time, is not to be thought of merely as the visible three-dimensional thing it appears to be, as for instance, my hand that I can see before me at this moment, but as describing a line in the dimension of time. My hand and my body did not describe the same lines. It would be better perhaps to say that they are not only extended in the three dimensions of space, but also in the fourth dimension. Such world lines lie in the fourth dimension. Where world lines converge or meet, there is a point in the four-dimensional world, which, if our conscious experience relates us to that world point, we call our present moment, and discover in it objects in a certain relation to one another in a three-dimensional space. So a quote from Minkowski: "The whole universe is seen to resolve itself into similar world lines, and I would fain anticipate myself by saying that in my opinion physical laws might find their most perfect expression as a reciprocal relation between these world lines." We shall see later on that Fechner had similar ideas of the world. We have, moreover, to think that our own lives are lines in the four-dimensional world, and that psychologically speaking, these lines have existence, and presumably have reciprocal relations between them as lines, not only as points. We will come to the idea of the extension of our lives in higher dimensions subsequently.